Okay, so be seated and take your Bibles and open to Romans chapter 13, which is the text that we're going to look at. So I've titled this section, What About Caesar? What about Caesar? And the purpose of that title is to help us again to focus on the fact that Romans 13 is written for the Christians in Rome in 57 AD under the authority of Caesar Nero, whichever way you put it. Okay, and we got to keep that in mind because the scriptures are written for them and not for us. Okay, is that right? It was written to, I've forgotten.
To them for us.
To them for us. It was written to them and to their specific situation. But the truths, the principles are for us, and so we need to grab it that way. Now, let me say up front here again that as I've read various commentaries and sermons and even internet things through our whole COVID thing about this chapter, I find that most writers ignore the text of what Paul is saying. And they especially ignore the context in which Paul said this. And they've totally misused it. It's almost as if they want the text to back up what they're doing. And you can't do that. You cannot approach the Bible that way. And so we want to make sure that we're going to do it right. So what we're going to do today, beginning today, is today and next week we're going to look at verses 1 through 7. But I want to start today with a little bit of a history lesson. I think it's important that you understand the historical context, because it's written to these guys in a specific context. And sometimes we read it here in 2024 and we have no clue what kinds of things they were going through, what was important to them, what they thought about the government. And so as I give you a little bit of this history, you're going to discover some things that you're going to go, well, this is what I would think of the government if I were them, and that's probably true. So we're going to do that. We're going to look at a little bit of their history. Then I'm going to bring Paul's own specific history into context as well, so you know where Paul is, because he's not in Rome when he writes this letter. And so you need to know where he's at. And then we're going to look at verses 1 and 2. And then next week we're going to come back and look at verses 3 to 7. And hopefully some application for it as well. So, oh boy, I have to give this. Tim wanted to give these. I have a handout for you that it's good for you to follow if you can. I didn't put my sources on the handout for where I got all this information, but you can, if you Google Jews and Romans in the first century, you can get a lot of information here. But there's lots of historical books and church history books that will tell you about the relationship of the Jews and the Romans and all that. So it's pretty clear. So I'm going to sort of follow along down this. So the column on the right is historical things within the Christian community. The dates are down the middle. Then did I say on the right? On the left is the Christian things. On the right are the historical things that are happening in the Roman Empire that are pertinent to the context we need to come to. So Paul wrote the letter of Romans to the Christians who live in the capital city of Rome, of the Roman Empire, sometime in the year 57 AD. So Jesus died in 30, and this is now 27 years later. He told us in chapter 23 that there will be that he's going to bring his judgment on Israel, the judgment that God predicted back in Exodus 28. It is going to finally come. And it would happen within 40 years. So we're 37 years out now from that. And Paul is writing this here as he's winding up his third missionary journey. So this is Acts 19 and Acts 20. It's about a year after the Ephesus riot, which occurred in 56 AD. And I mention that because the Ephesus riot is actually very important because it shows the influence that the gospel had on society without doing anything to purposely change society. Right? All they did was preach the gospel. For 3 years, Paul was in Ephesus. He preached the gospel. People were saved. And by near the end of that time, the economy became so bad because people were no longer buying the statues that the silversmiths made. And they were losing money. That a riot occurred because of the economy. And I'll come back to that later. So that shows that influence. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, in 63 BC, Palestine was conquered by Pompey and for Julius Caesar and Augustus, and the Jewish people were really large during that time. In fact, there was one book estimated that there were 7 million Jews just in the city of Rome alone. So that's a lot. They would be there because they were captives, remember, in Babylon, and then many of them stayed in Persia and in Greece, and many of them had returned. And so they're all through this place. And what Julius Caesar and Augustus did is they made laws that would actually protect the Jews' worship. They thought that their worship was because they didn't worship multiple gods, so they couldn't adopt any of the Roman gods, that they said, okay, you can be isolated. You can build your synagogues and you can keep your own worship and be isolated within Roman society. So they were exempt from the state religious rituals. They were given permission to follow their own laws, customs, and religion. Of course, whenever Rome conquered a country or a nation, their men were brought into the Roman army. They were subscripted and had to serve in the Roman army, but Jews were exempt from military service. It's important to note that the Jews did not have a religio licita, which means a permitted religion. They were not recognized as an official religion. They were just given permission to practice it on their own. And it's really important because Rome is a sacral society. It has a state religion. Its economy is held together by its Roman imperial cult worship and the worship of the many idols which are part of that. And so it's important to remember that. So in terms of their Jewishness, the Jews were totally isolated from Roman culture. But in terms of their non-Jewishness, like going to the market to buy food, you didn't have to buy it from a Jew. You could buy it from a Gentile. They were somewhat integrated, but not completely, because they really isolated themselves geographically even. So even in the city of Rome, there was the Jewish quarter. Just like if you go to Toronto, there's the Italian quarter, there's the Chinese quarter, there's all the ethnic groups have their own little pockets. And they're there. Well, the Jews had that as well. The Jews did have to pay a temple tax, which was really a tax that Rome put on them, but it was paid through the temple in order for Herod to be able to keep up the care of the temple area. So the relationship between Rome and Jews then began to deteriorate when Caesar Caligula. Okay, so when Jesus died, it was Caesar Augustus, and then Caligula became Caesar in 37, so 7 years after the death of Christ. And what he did was he ordered that every temple throughout the empire had to have a statue of himself, because he was a self-proclaimed god that needed to be worshipped. So that imperial cult became really strong. So he ordered the Jews to erect a statue of himself in the temple in Jerusalem. Of course, they wouldn't have anything to do with that, and they rebelled, and there was a fight ensuing, except that Caligula was murdered, and his murders stopped that from happening. Claudius becomes the new emperor in 41, and he bans the Jews he bans the Jews from the city of Rome in 49. You remember that? That's specifically written in the book of Acts. He bans the Jews from Rome because he was tired of their constant complaining when they had nothing to do with anything, and the conflicts between the Christians and the Jews. Who are the Jews? Remember, they're always trying to get the Christians to come under the old covenant. And he got tired of it in the city, and so he said, "Okay, all of you Jews out, get out." And they did. So that was 41 or 49, and they were not allowed to return until actually after he died. So this is when the problems really began between the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers in Rome, and which is the reason why Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. Remember, he's trying to deal with this potential conflict. He's saying, look, no, the Gentile Christians are not under the law, but neither are you Jewish Christians under the law. We looked at all of that in chapters 1 to 11. So Paul once and for all settled the question of what followers of Jesus were to do with that old covenant law. And Paul emphatically states that it's over. They are no longer under its jurisdiction. And they have to live as brothers now in the city of Rome with a united front. They're to show brotherly love to one another. We learn this in chapter 12. And this love is to become an influence on those who are not saved. But they're living in this culture now, which is made up of Jewish hatred and made up of Roman cultish imperial worship and paganism. So how do you live as a Christian in that? So Paul's going to deal with that from chapters 12 on. So enter Nero. It's now 54 AD. Enter Nero. And we tend to give Nero, we remember him for his narcissistic, immoral behavior and persecution of the Christians. But Nero actually started out really good. Okay, when he became the emperor, Nero was actually a young man who enjoyed the theater, he enjoyed music, he liked horse racing. He was responsible for building a lot of the racetracks that we see throughout the empire that even exist still today. And he ended the secret trials that the courts had because they were really immoral and unjust. He gave the Senate more independence. He banned capital punishment. Some people think that's a good thing, some people not, but he did. He reduced taxes. Imagine that, a Caesar reducing taxes, but he did. He also allowed slaves to sue unjust owners, which was something brand new. He gave assistance to cities that suffered natural disasters, and he gave aid to the Jews. And in fact, he was the one who allowed the Jews to return to the city of Rome in 54. And he also established open competitions in poetry, drama, and athletics. So he was really building the society of Rome. Nero's problems began with his mother. Okay, his mother's name was Agrippina. And in fact, she was the one who had Claudius murdered so that Nero could become the emperor, because she wanted her son on the throne. And but she was one of these mothers that ruled everything. So you do as I say. And Nero was getting sick of it because her influence was so strong, and he didn't want to be dominated by her anymore, so he actually had her retired in 56. And I'm not exactly sure what that means, but I guess it means that she was out of the palace area, so that her influence wasn't there anymore. But she continued to control him and to make him do stuff, so he decided, well, okay, Mom, that's the way you're going to be, I'm going to kill you. He tried to do it secretly, but the attempt to do it secretly failed. So in his frustration, he says, forget it, and he sent a bunch of soldiers to her house and they killed her. Everybody knows it. Well, this caused an uproar in the city because one of the worst crimes that could be committed in Rome is called matricide. Okay, it's not tearing your mattress apart, it's killing your mother, your matron. Okay, and so people were shocked at that, but he did it. And soon after that, so that's around 56, soon after that, a dark side begins to show up in Nero. He had these impulses for extravagance, and it wasn't long before stories started to circulate that he seduced married women, he brought in young boys, and he did a whole bunch of other things, hideous things, immoral things that are really, they're too immoral to mention here. But this is what his life was like. He was an extremely immoral man. In 64, Nero, we all know this story, that he had set the city of Rome on fire because he wanted to rebuild it, make it more modern and more fancy. And so he set it on fire, but he got some backlash because of that. So he said, oh, it wasn't me. And looking around, he says, okay, who can I blame this on? And we know from the book of Acts that he blamed it on the Christians. But now he's blaming it on Christians that he sees as being a part of the Jewish sect. They thought they were just Jews that believed something a little different than the regular Jews. And so he made them the scapegoats and persecuted them through that. Now, it was a bad time for the Christians, but it was very short time. It was a very limited amount of persecution. And what's really interesting here is that that Paul was imprisoned in Rome just before that. And Paul was released in 64. So he was in prison in 62 to 64, but he was released before that. Otherwise, Paul might have been martyred earlier than he really was. So God was looking after him. So Nero's persecution of the Christians, again, as I said, was brief, and it wasn't repeated anywhere else in the empire, so it wasn't widespread. And that's the thing that a lot of people get wrong. In fact, they talk about the whole signing the paper that Caesar is Lord, and the Christians, of course, couldn't do that, and so that didn't come to the 200s. This is not under Nero that this happened. So with Nero's mother dead, the emperor was beyond anyone's control, and Rome now becomes the victim to an arbitrary desires of a mad tyrant. And there's only one solution when you get a guy at the top who's like that. And so they tried to assassinate him, but the first attempt failed in 65 AD, and so Nero doubled his guard, and he unleashed a terror on Rome, on the Roman citizens themselves. Huge numbers of people, including members of the Senate, were executed. In 66, Jewish freedom forces declared war on Rome. And so the Jewish-Roman War begins. Now, it's mostly in Galilee where the fighting is occurring, but it's war nonetheless. Meanwhile, Cestius Gallus, the general, was dispatched to Jerusalem, and on his way, he's going down the coast, and he stops in Caesarea, and he massacres a bunch of Jews in Caesarea before heading on to Jerusalem, where he puts Jerusalem under siege. On his retreat, and nobody knows why he retreated from that, except we know why, because it made the Christians realize, okay, when you see Rome coming, then you need to depart from the city, which they did, and also because it wasn't God's timing for when the city was to be destroyed. But when he retreated, the Jewish resistance forces, they attacked his army and destroyed them all. Vespasian then the general was sent to Galilee to dispatch to Galilee and to fight the rebel forces, and he forced them all to retreat to the city of Jerusalem. And we've talked about the conditions in Jerusalem at the time of 70 AD. So now Titus, his son, and his Vespasian are there. They haven't put the city in siege yet, but he's there. But in the meantime, Paul has been released, and he's heading out to his missionary journey, and he now has returned for some reason to Rome. We don't know whether it was by force or by his own accord, but he's in Rome. He gets arrested with Peter, and Peter is crucified in 66, and Paul is martyred under Nero in 67. We don't know for certain, but it was probably they were arrested because they were Jews, and they were influential Jews in Rome, and there was a war between the Jews and the Romans. Finally, Rome had enough with Nero, and in 68, a revolt happened in the northern territories, and the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. And the interesting thing about that is this means that anybody can kill him without punishment. You don't have to be afraid. And so, terrified, Nero flees to the country with a few of his remaining slaves, and he kills himself and all his slaves. Without heirs, of course, now there's nobody to become the leader of the empire. So what were they going to do? So with the ultimate prize up for grabs, rival generals all begin to move their troops into the city, and are all vying for the top man position. And guess what happens? Civil war breaks out in the city of Rome. So the Roman-Jewish war takes a hiatus while they're having this civil war. Meanwhile, Vespasian and Titus are sitting down there in Palestine waiting orders as to what to do. Well, eventually what happens is the Senate calls Vespasian back to Rome, and he settles everything up, and they all name him the new emperor. And the first thing that he does, of course, is he gives the order to Titus, go ahead and lay siege to Jerusalem and put an end to this war. Of course, the city is destroyed, the temple is destroyed in AD 70. So that's the history. And what I want you to see here is, I'll put it on the screen here. I want you to see, because it's important that you know that Nero had good years and bad years. He had more good than he had bad. So from 54 to 63 were really his good years. I mean, morally he was getting worse and worse through that period of time, but as a leader and as a persecutor, it wasn't until 64 that kind of thing began to happen. And Paul writes the letter of Romans in 57, so it's during those good years. So Romans 13, when he talks about now about the government, this is during the good times with Nero. Of course, later Paul is brought into Rome under house arrest in 62, and he died, and he's released in 64. So let me very quickly put Paul into perspective here. Paul begins his third missionary journey in 53 AD, and he arrives in the city of Ephesus in early 54. Okay, he stays there about 3 months, sees a successful evangelism campaign, as I said, and it was so successful that it had this negative effect on the economy for the local city, because the economy was dependent on the sale of relics, religious relics, to the goddess Diana, or Artemis, same person anyways. So the silversmiths began a riot against the Christians. The town clerk comes along, he's the hero of the day, and it says for 3 hours they shouted hail to Diana, and he calms them all down. He says, look, if you got a problem, just take them to court. And they go, oh, okay, and they all leave. So Paul writes this letter in 57, near the end of his third missionary journey, just before he goes to the city of Jerusalem. Remember, everybody said, no, don't go to Jerusalem. His last act on his missionary journey was he's preaching, and the young fella is sitting in the windowsill listening to his preaching, and it's now going on 7 hours, and he falls asleep, and he falls out of the window and dies, landing on the ground outside, and Paul comes along, and he is miraculously healed. So that's there. Then he said, don't go to Jerusalem because they're going to kill you there. Well, he says, no, I've got to go to Jerusalem. He goes to Jerusalem. He's arrested, and then for his own protection, he moved to Caesarea, and this is where he gets to share the gospel with the governor and with the various political figures there. And then he says he appeals to Caesar, which would be Nero, and so he gets on a boat, heads there, and then there's the shipwreck. Finally gets there and arrives in Rome in 62, and he's put under house arrest and then released in 64. Okay, so and all of this is recorded for us in the last 8 chapters of the book of Acts. So Paul's released just before the great fire in Rome, before the persecution of the Christians begins. So you can see how God protected Paul in terms of the timing here of the events. But you can also see how God was preparing the Christians in Rome for the persecution that was coming simply through the letter that Paul had written to them. It was all good timing. And so can you imagine when Nero starts blaming the Christians, and they're looking at Romans 13, it says, be subject to the governing authorities. Obey your governors. What are they going to do with that, right? So this is why we need to understand the history. All right, so again, skip that part. All right, so this brings us then to our text. So if you've got the text in front of you, Romans chapter 13, I want us to look fairly quickly here at verses 1 and 2. Now, let me say again, you've heard me many times when we've looked at verses where I say to you, this verse is really hard to interpret from the Greek. Remember me saying things like that? Okay, and I'll give you a literal translation, and it sounds really wonky, but it sort of makes things clear. And then to try to translate it is just almost impossible. So our English scholars try to do their best, but they put a lot of interpretation into it when they're supposed to be just translating, which frustrates me, but nevertheless. So this text is not one of those. Okay, that's what I want you to understand. Verses 1 to 7 is probably the clearest and easiest text to translate from the Greek to English. It's really simple. Yet we have complicated it so bad. And I hope that you see that when we go through this. So look at verse 1. Okay, so on the screen, this is how I've structured the verses 1 to 7. So verse 1, it says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. My Christian brothers, I want you to be subject to the government of the city of Rome. That's what he's telling them. That includes Nero, to the Senate, to all of their laws. This is Paul's thesis in this section, if you will. And he tells them why we are to be subject to the governing authorities in the next part of verse 1. He says, for, you see the word for, it's the Greek word gar, which is giving an explanation. Why do we have to be subject to the governing authorities? For, or because there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. This is very simple to understand. Everybody is to put himself in subjection to the authorities that are over him, and they are to do this because God appointed them. Isn't that simple? So then, verse 2. I think our Bible says therefore, but it really should be so then. So it's sort of drawing a conclusion from that statement, from the why statement. Okay, God has appointed those authorities. So then, because God put them in authority, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. Pretty simple. You must obey the governing authorities. Why? Because God appointed those authorities over you. So then, if you do not obey those governing authorities over you, you are going against God's appointment, and judgment will incur. Isn't that simple? Pretty straightforward. So what I want you to see here is the word resist. It occurs here 3 times in our English translation. But there's actually two different Greek words, and they have slightly different meanings. They can both be translated resist, but when there's two different words, I would tend to translate them differently, so you would see that. So the first word is the word antitassomenos, which means to resist or to oppose. So anyone who opposes what the government has put in place. It's a military term that means to battle against or to set oneself against. Now, we're going to learn in verses 3 and 4 what it is that the government, what specific things he is referring to. So I'm going to leave that out just momentarily, just leave it open. So a general statement, anyone who opposes the governing authority, they're opposing God. And so the first resist there means to oppose. So he's saying here, the one who opposes the authority that's above him has resisted the ordinance of God. This is the second one. So this is the word anthestinkein, and it means to stand against. Okay, so the one you're opposing, so you're actually fighting with, you're battling, you're setting up a fight. Okay? You're with the authorities. If you do that, you're now standing against God. Okay, the one who opposes the authority above him has stood against the ordinance of God. And those having stood against God's ordinance or God's appointment will bring judgment upon himself. So it's fairly simple. The authority that's above you or over you was put there by God. And you, if you oppose that authority, you're standing against God. And that's going to result in judgment. Okay? And we got to be careful because he has not defined anything here at this point. He doesn't define what it means. Okay? He's basically saying that when the government says do this, you do it. Because if you don't do it, you're opposing God. You're sinning against God by not obeying the government. So of course, back in 2000, when our government made statements that we cannot meet together for worship. Pardon? 2020. Then some churches said, no, we're not going to obey that rule because that would be to disobey God. But according to this verse, and I'm not speaking my opinion on this yet, but according to this verse, to disobey that is to disobey God. But it's going to be redefined in verses 3 and 4. So that we can find out then, well, is disobeying our government in 2020, was that a sin against God? A sin against God in terms of verses 1 and 2 of Romans 13? Were they asking us to do something that was disobedient to God, that we need to disobey the government? Okay, according to Acts chapter 4 and chapter 5. Okay, so it's complicated, but I want us to really understand this text clearly. So it's pretty clear. Paul's thesis statement is that everyone is to be subject to the authority that's over him. Why? Because God put that authority over them, and to oppose it is to stand against God. That's pretty simple, straightforward. That's his thesis and his reason for it. So in the context of Romans 12, because again, I read so many things, and they take it out of the context of Romans 12, and you can't do that. And in one commentary, it's very point blank said this has nothing to do with Paul's talk about love in Romans 12. Well, it has everything to do with it. Because in the context, Paul has told the Christians in the city of Rome that they have to renew the way they think. They got to change the way they think about everything. We don't think about government the way the world thinks about government. There's a new way of thinking that is coming down the line. And the Holy Spirit's going to help us to do that. Within the new covenant of Christ, there's a new law in place that teaches us how we are to relate to the government. And he points it and how we're to relate to everybody. So within the body of Christ, this is how you're to treat Christians. Outside of the body of Christ, this is how you're to treat those non-Christians. And he says, and then logically the next question is, well, wait a minute, Caesar's not a Christian, do we got to treat him like that? He says, okay, considering talking about the government, yeah, you got to change the way you think about the government. And so he lays this out clearly before them. Our lot is to be genuine, 12:9. How? By detesting what is evil and holding on to what is good, he said. Okay, we're to have brotherly affection within the body of Christ, Christian to Christian, that's 12:10. We're to live in harmony with those outside of the body, Christian to non-Christian, 12:16. Verse 21, he says, don't let evil win out in your relationships, but overcome evil with good. Be good to everyone. Why? Because this is the greatest influence on society. And that influence can get all the way up to the top, which historically we know had happened in the 300s. Emperor Constantine becomes a believer. And the natural question that comes to the minds of these Roman Christians is, well, what about Caesar? What about the tax collector? What about these Roman authorities who are not believers? What do we do with them? How do we relate to them? And Paul's answer is verse 1, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. The first thing that you need to know here is that in terms of our text, the word governing is not in the Greek text. The Greek text is actually those who are over you. And so the interpretation is that those who are over you are the governing authorities. But I think that Paul has more than just government here. Because you can be a slave in that economy, and you would have a master over you. You can be a married woman, and you have a husband over you. You can be an employee, and you have an employer over you. There's all kinds of levels above you. And I think that Paul in this initial statement is talking about them all. So I think they're wrong in saying governing authorities, but because the simplicity of it is let every soul to the authorities who are above him be subject, be in obedience. Now the supporting text does talk about rulers and it does talk about taxes, so it's not a wrong implication because they are included in there as well. But now he specifically goes to the government authorities. But here could mean, again, the thinking of this age is that every person should rebel against authorities. We read that in one of our other texts that we in our scripture reading, that everybody was rebelling. And Paul, and I think it was the Timothy one maybe, or maybe it was the Peter one, said don't rebel against them because that's the norm. Rebel against the taxes, rebel against the rules of the government, rebel against everything. And he says that's the world's way of thinking. That's this age. Don't be conformed to this age. It's new thinking. It's renewed minds. It's transformation that Paul is talking about. That's going to give the greatest effect. And being a Christian may cause you to think that you are to reject everything that's in this age. And I think that might have been their first reaction to it. Is when Paul said, don't be conformed to this age, they thought that meant everything. We drop everything. We don't accept anything of this age. No, he wasn't saying that. It's not saying become isolated. You are an essential part of the society, the pagan society. And you need to participate, but you're there to influence them. And so to do not conform does not mean reject, but it means to be part of it. So don't refuse to pay your taxes. Pay them. But the context is, again, it's about transformation. And so if you can translate this verse, another way of doing it is let every Christian person living in Rome be subject to those authorities within the empire's capital city. That's the historical context. So what does it mean to be subject? And I'm almost done. To be subject to those who authority over you. Well, very simply, the word subject means to follow or to obey. So Paul is living in a corrupt pagan government system. He's writing to people living in the capital city where the Caesars are implementing their whims quite readily. And even though Nero wasn't really bad at this point, okay, he knew he could change at any moment. It's happened before. And look at the history. I already took you through that. Okay, and he's commanding them to obey the governing authorities, whether they are good or evil. He's not applying this to any specific case at this point. And he's not defining it. He's just making a broad statement. This is his thesis statement. This is what genuine Christian love looks like. This is what the transformed, renewed mind of the Christian looks like. It's all about loving one another, loving God. And he's going to come back to that in the last half of chapter 13. If you want to read that, you see there, he even lists the 10 commandments. And he says, love is the fulfillment of those. Okay? It's about having an effective Christian witness that treats other Christians good and treats non-believers good. It's about influence. So why should we obey? Again, verse 2 is very clear, because God ordained the authority, and to resist them is to stand against God. And it says, and it will bring judgment. So the question there is, well, is that a judgment from God because we're disobeying God, or is that a judgment from the authority? I think the context is clear that it's a judgment from the authority. And if you disobey the authority, they're not going to let you get away with that. You're going to suffer the consequences. And we saw that through the whole pandemic situation, that Christians and even non-Christians, when they stood up against the government, up against the authority, they suffered consequences. And sometimes it is necessary and it's right, and we do take the consequences. The judgment here is not God's judgment, but the judgment from those of authority. So, they're from God, and they're by God, so you see that clearly there. Twice he mentions it in the verse. God has sovereignly decreed the governing authorities should exist in levels of society. God rules over kings. Okay, remember Jeremiah? He said to all of the nations surrounding Nebuchadnezzar, he says, I want you all to submit to him. He says, I've put your lands in his hand. I've given to him. And King Nebuchadnezzar is my servant. Okay, and if you look at verses 3 and 4, you'll see the word servant, talking about the authorities. They're servants. The kings are God's servants. In Daniel 4 and Daniel 5, he said to Nebuchadnezzar specifically, he says, the Most High rules the kingdoms of men and gives it to whom he wills. So Nebuchadnezzar, it doesn't matter what you want, it's God's rules. And we can say the same thing about our own government. And Mr. Trudeau, it doesn't matter what you want to do, you only are doing what God allows you to do. God will take the government from you, or take the country from you, or even put our country under the rule of another country if he wants to. So then, and this is the important part, verse 2, instead of therefore, it should be so then, because God put them in authority. Whoever opposes the authority stands against God, who has made their appointment. If you oppose the authority that God's put in place, even someone like Nero, if you oppose and disobey the government, then you're standing against the government that God ordained. Okay, so this is really not difficult to understand. The problem comes when we try to take the general principle and apply it to specific situations. Because right now he's not making application. He doesn't do that until verses 3 to 5. Okay, and so we've got to get there to understand before we say, well, then disobeying the order to wear masks, is that right or wrong? Disobeying to close our churches, is that right or wrong? We can't answer that by verses 1 and 2. The principle is you obey the governing authorities. To disobey them is to disobey God. Couldn't be any clearer. You follow? Okay? But to apply it to any specific situation, we need to know what he says in verses 3 to 5, which we're going to get at next week. So let me leave it there, and we'll come back to that. Certainly one of the things that we need to do is to determine, is the government asking us to do something that would make us disobey God in anything? That's certainly a question that needs to be asked. And of course the question here is, are we to obey everything the government tells us to do, even if it isn't in direct opposition to God? And let me leave you with this question, because to get your minds intrigued a little bit and to bring it applicable to Canada in 2024. The question is this. It's a twofold question. Number one, do we have to obey Prime Minister Trudeau? Do we have to obey unelected health officers? That's the first question. The second question is, what is the governing authority in Canada? What is the governing authority in Canada? Now, how we answer those, especially the second question, is really going to help us to make the application of verses 3 to 5. So we're going to look at that next week. And so we'll end there. Tim, if you want to just shut off the tape, please.